Good afternoon, and welcome to this year's Cushwa Center Lecture. My name is David Lantigua. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Theology here at Notre Dame, and along with my colleague Darren Dochek, I co-direct Notre Dame's Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism. I want to acknowledge first our co-sponsors for today's lecture, the Department of History and the Department of Theology. Thank you. And I'd also like to thank all of you for joining us on this beautiful afternoon, especially those who may be attending a Cushwa Center event for the first time. Since Martin Marty delivered the first Cushwa lecture in 1984, this lecture series has provided an opportunity for the Notre Dame community to hear some of the most renowned writers and scholars from across the country on topics including religion and public life, global Catholic history, Catholicism and the arts, the sociology of religion, and more. This year's lecture is no exception. I'm very excited and gratified to welcome Professor Garry Sparks as our speaker today, whose work I have known for years but have yet had the opportunity to meet him until today. Professor Sparks is Associate Professor in the Department of Religion at Princeton University. Prior to joining Princeton last year, Professor Sparks taught for 9 years at George Mason University, and he received his PhD from the University of Chicago. Professor Sparks' work focuses on the intersection of ethnohistory, theology, and questions of enculturation, especially within the early contact period of Mesoamerica and the encounter and interaction among the Mayan peoples with Spanish missionaries. In addition to the 16th century colonial period in Mesoamerica, Professor Sparks writes and teaches on current religious movements like liberation theologies, Indian theology, Latin American Protestantism, and the revitalization of indigenous traditions. His first book, which I am proud to say I endorsed on its back cover, The America's First Theologies, Early Sources of Post-Contact Indigenous Religion, was published by Oxford University Press in 2017. This book, which I consider a landmark in intercultural theology, was followed by Rewriting Maya Religion, Domingo de Vico, Quiche Maya Intellectuals, and the Theologia Indorum, published by University Press of Colorado in 2019. In addition to his teaching and publishing, Dr. Sparks is a member of the editorial board of the International Journal of Latin American Religions, and he is on the advisory committee for the Maya Book Project. Together with Dr. Frauke Saxi, Dr. Sparks is currently working on his third book project, a critical edition of the Kislak 1015 manuscript held at the Library of Congress. His project is titled Pastoral Field Notes, a 16th Century Handbook from the Maya Highlands. He's also coordinating critical translations into English and Spanish of the entire Theologia Indorum from Mayan language manuscripts, a lifelong ambition. His research has been supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Academy of Religion, and the American Philosophical Society. The title of Dr. Sparks' lecture this afternoon is 500 Years of Mayanized Christianity, an ethnohistory of the America's First Theology, the Theologia Indorum. I have full confidence you're going to enjoy this journey to a new world with Professor Sparks as our guide. Please join me in welcoming him to the University of Notre Dame.
Good afternoon, and thank you, David, for that very generous and kind introduction, and to Darren as well for the opportunity and invitation to be with you all this afternoon. I do want to give two acknowledgements. One is to a collaborator in Guatemala, Sakejij Candelaria Lopez Escoy, researcher at the Jesuit University, Rafael Landivar, a native Quiche speaker, established scholar and in her own right. And as David said, Dr. Frauke Saxe, previously at Bond University, now presently the Director of Pre-Columbian Studies at Dunbarton Oaks, Harvard University in Washington, D.C. This kind of project is highly interdisciplinary and also touches a lot on Native American sources, wisdom traditions. And I just think it's ethically, but also academically, scholarly appropriate to involve those communities which heritage is being addressed and spoken about This talk would be extremely short, paltry, and thin if it were not for the over decade collaboration I've had with both of them, as well as other Maya collaborators. Like the adage regarding history, theology, that is a people's meta-discourse on their religious construals, is likewise written by the victors, with non-dominant theologies rarely written down or preserved, and even eventually destroyed. And for the most part, the transmission history of the arrival of Christianity to the Americas, like its transmission throughout Eurasia and Northern Africa in its initial 1,500 years, comes from sources largely written by the proverbial victors. However, by the mid-16th century, indigenous materials, namely from Mesoamerica, provide for the first time an ethnohistorical perspective on not only transmission histories of Christianity by missionaries, but also a reception history by native elites and their varying efforts at reconfiguring their own religious worldviews, if not also contextualizing Christianity. In fact, this February marks the entrance of the first Europeans into what is now Guatemala exactly 500 years ago, including the arrival of the first Christian clergy. Among the earliest of these post-contact indigenous documents are those written by the Highland Maya beginning in the 1550s. By the time Spaniards arrived into the region in early 1524, they were confronted by the already well-established nations of the Quiche and Quechical Maya, indicated in green on this map, as well as numerous other Mayan languages which are still spoken to this day by millions of Guatemalans. Unlike other native modes of documentation, such as quipu by the Inca in South America, the indigenous peoples of Mesoamerica already had a long history of writing books, including the Maya, who already had developed a phonetic-based writing system centuries prior to the contact with Europeans. Their ancient hieroglyphic and archaeological record events various periods of significant religious exchange, especially around the 12th century. From the perspective of Mesoamerican authors, the arrival of Christianity by the 16th century was only the latest in a series of interreligious engagements. Within only a couple of decades, the Highland Maya are among the first native peoples to appropriate the alphabet developed by mendicant missionaries, which they then used to write their own documents in their Mayan languages for their own purposes, addressed exclusively to Maya audiences. These are not documents directed to the crown, to colonial courts, or for or with the church. Among these Maya texts is one of the most important pieces of indigenous American literature, the Popol Vuh, or Book of the Council. Written in Quiche between 1554 and 1558 by the last generation who personally knew their pre-contact world, the Popol Vuh is the oldest and one of the most extensive set of cosmogonic and theogonic stories of any indigenous people in either North or South America. And aside from a couple of references in the beginning and end, the bulk of the text exhibits no Christian references. In fact, the antiquity of its stories can be confirmed in the archaeological record, as far back as the 3rd century, if not 4th century BCE, even though this ceramic is from the Common Era. Furthermore, the Popol Vuh is merely a cornerstone in a larger body of around 40 16th century Maya texts, including the only surviving pre-Hispanic play. While they vary in the extent to which they preserve native religious stories, beliefs, and practices, altogether this Quichean literature is among the earliest native religious writings we have in all of the Americas. However, this early post-contact literature also provides insights into the debates between indigenous elites on how to engage Christianity, specifically as presented to them by the competing mendicant orders, when the first missionaries struggled to learn native languages and to translate rather recondite concepts from Hispano-Catholicism. Upon their arrival into Guatemala, really beginning in the 1530s, Franciscans and Dominicans brought with them their competing theologies and theories of translation, predicated on different linguistic and semiotic ideologies. While also related to the respective missions to convert Arabic-speaking populations in southern Iberia, the introduction of the theology of Thomas Aquinas by the 1520s as the curricular standard in centers in Spain, such as Valladolid and Salamanca, differentiated approaches taken by the mendicants, namely, Dominicans trained in Thomistic realism versus the nominalism of William of Ockham, taught in Franciscan convents. In general, Dominicans in Guatemala distinguish between the modus significandi, or the mode of signification, such as a word, and the res significata, that is to say, its referent, the meaning of the word. For many Dominicans, the appropriation of religious terms from local or indigenous cultures to convey Christianity was not only possible, but a necessary prerequisite for successful religious conversion. By contrast, according to Dominican nominalists who denied the existence of universals, concepts were just generalized names for real objects, particulars, and thus a signifier and what it signified could not be separated. A word in one language could not be readily detached from its meaning as then to really refer to an idea in another language. Christian concepts were not to be translated with terms from indigenous languages without risking misunderstanding or even worse, heresy. Therefore, rather than native loanwords, Franciscans preferred the creation of neologisms and ad verbum rather than ad sensum translations of doctrinal and biblical phrases. And just to give you a small sample set of what I mean by here, the upper part are the kinds of languages and discourse we find within Franciscan material. You see, you have a native language text, and then it'll be peppered with the importation of phrases, words from Latin or Spanish. If it's a literal translation, if it's a literal term they're comfortable with, such as the concept of a savior, someone who rescues or saves someone else, colonel, then you can talk about Christ as a colonel. The real sort of innovation that the Franciscans make that's enduring is the phonetic modification of the Spanish word Dios to be Dios. There's no D in many Mayan languages. And to this day, in fact, if you asked a Quiche speaker, how do you say thank you, they most likely would say Maltios, having no knowledge or recognition that that's actually a construct by Franciscans in the 16th century to literally say thanks be to God, with that Dios and Maltios etymologically being Dios. It's just now the Quiche way of speaking, saying thank you. By contrast, the Dominicans are looking for local words that they think are highly proximate or commensurate. And some of these actually have a great deal of antiquity. For example, the lexical pair, anal-shashal, which literally means yellowness and greenness, we can actually trace all the way back in the hieroglyphic writings to, say, 3rd century of the Common Era. It refers to wealth, material riches, probably reference to gold and jade, or ripe and ripening maize of a bountiful harvest. The Dominicans will repurpose that, anal-rashal, to mean glory, the glory of Adam and Eve in a prelapsarian Eden, the glory of God above the celestial host, the glory of Christ at the right hand of the Father, the glory of the heavenly afterlife for the meritorious. Where the real rubber hits the road, and is quite a vocal debate in the 16th century, is around the term cabowir. For Franciscans, it refers to only the carved wood or stone effigy that offerings and prayers are made. For the Dominicans, they'll say, no, that's just the symbol, that's just the sign. What that's referring to is a Maya deity, and therefore that is the Maya concept of divinity. So when we're trying to explain the divinity of Christ, or God is divine, that's the local term we need to lean into. This will become a huge issue between the two orders for the subsequent centuries. Now, of the early Dominican missionaries to the region, let me point out one more example, which is about the doctrine of the Trinity. 16th century, there appears to be no word for person. Winak really just means people. So the Dominicans will say, well, that's the closest term we have when we talk about the three persons of the Trinity. We'll talk about the three peoples of the Trinity. We'll just put an abstractive suffix at the end. Franciscans think that's inappropriate, so they import and use the Latin or the Spanish persona. They'll mark it syntactically with Maya grammar. We will see later in the 17th century Franciscans beginning to use winak, but that doesn't mean the Franciscans have changed their position. It means the semantic range of the term has actually shifted to also include a person. And to this day, if you asked a Quiche speaker, how do you say a person, they would say hunwinak. If you said, how do you say a people, they would say hunwinak. So the term is now accommodating both positions. Little translations of the first two personae, God the Father, God the Son, they're fine with that being literal, with fatherhood and sonship in local Maya culture. But when it comes to the third person, the Holy Spirit, again, Dominicans will look for a local term that's close to breath, wind, spirit, to spirate,
and that will be Uxlap. So they'll talk about the breath of God, Dios Ruxlapil. Again, Franciscans will feel weebie-jeebie about that and say, no, at that point you can only use the Latin or the Spanish to convey the third person of the Trinity. Now, of the early mendicant missionaries to Guatemala, Domingo de Vico wrote some of the first important works in numerous Mayan languages after arriving in 1545, with over 40 other Dominican missionaries, one of the largest cohort of missionaries to Spanish America, all recruited by Bartolomé de las Casas when he was back in Spain. Within short time, Vico is said to have learned no less than 7 different Mayan languages. These are not dialects. These are mutually unintelligible languages like French is to German. The earliest and most extensive biographical information we have about Vico in Spanish sources don't appear really until the 17th century, except for the small paragraph at the bottom by Alonso de Zorita, who's a jurist commissioned by the Crown to conduct an audit in New Spain. But that's really about all we have until much later for Spanish sources, saying he's short, he's round, he's vociferous in his writing, knows many languages, quite active in the development of catechism and sermon materials in local languages, but also for the enslaved Black population within Santiago de Guatemala, now Antigua. However, what I think is much more interesting is that he's among the few Catholic clergy to be mentioned by these early Maya authors, who note not only the conditions of his death 10 years after it happened in 1565, but also speak of him rather fondly as a Nima Achtich, a great teacher. This is Pokumchi that documents at the Princeton University Library, and the one next to it is in Cachiquel. So from 2 different Maya groups from different parts of Guatemala. Now, just a year prior to his death in 1555, Vico completed his magnum opus, the Theologia Indorum, Theology of the Indians or Theology for the Indians. I think the double entendre actually speaks accurately of the document's nature. It consists of over 800 manuscript pages divided into 217 chapters across 2 large volumes, and it addresses a variety of theological, moral, and cultural issues to, for, and about the Maya people. And it still remains to this day one of the longest single texts written in a Native American language. As one of the first generations of Spanish students to study at the University of Salamanca after the arrival of Francisco de Victoria and his establishment of Thomistic scholasticism alongside humanism of Diego de Deza and others as the curricular standard of the proverbial Salamanca school, Aquinas' Summa Theologiae serves as both the organizing structure for Vico's Theologia Indorum, but also the analogical method by which Vico strove to reconcile Catholicism with the Maya worldview. While not in the genre of a disputatio, so it's not organized by quaestio like Aquinas, Vico structures each volume of his Summa by 60 major themes or concepts, within which is a hierarchy of subchapters of supporting points and subpoints. For example, in Volume 1, which Vico finished in February 1553, he begins with the Thomistic themes of the attributes or names of God, the unmoved mover, if you will, and continues with stories and lessons from the Catholic Old Testament, while integrating along the way elements of the Highland Maya religion. The second volume, finished in 1554, presents narratives of the New Testament and then incorporates standard, but much more longer than we're used to seeing in native languages, explication of catechism material. At this point, catechisms in native languages are actually getting much brief. This is how you make the sign of the cross. This is the Ave Maria. This is the Lord's Prayer. He's saying this is what the sign of the cross means when we do it. This is what the Lord's Prayer means. Before I switch slides, I just ask you to take note right quick of chapter 30 of volume 1, which is his 4th major theme on earthly paradise. Now, in contrast to contemporaneous mendicant literature, Vico's Theologia Indorum, it distinguishes itself in 4 notable ways. First, his theology is not a translation of a previously written work elaborated in Iberia or elsewhere in Europe, imported to the Americas, and then translated into a native language. We have many cases of those, from Luis de Granada's Meditations, Thomas à Kempis's Imitation of Christ, even in Nahuatl, Aesop's Fables. But rather, he's explicitly referencing Maya rituals and mythical characters based on his own proto-ethnographic study among the Maya. Secondly, the Theologia Indorum was not ever written in Latin or Spanish, but originally composed in Mayan languages and still remains today largely untranslated outside of Mayan languages. Thirdly, the Theologia Indorum is the first known work written in either North or South America to be called a theology. In other words, this is the first original Christian theology composed in the Americas, and it's done so in an indigenous language. And I should say it's never published, so it has its own sort of skirting of any kind of lack of oversight in many respects. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the primary readers directly addressed by Vico are not fellow clergy. This is not a work for them, but rather literate Maya, to whom he addresses as Ish, you all, and Numial Nukahol, my daughters and my sons. To this extent, the Theologia Indorum is a direct Christian reply to the Maya and their cosmogonic narratives found in later texts like the Popol Vuh. And while no first generation or even complete manuscript by Vico survives, we have second, third generation copies at best and all fragmentary, I have managed to identify 20 partial versions in at least 4 different Mayan languages that thereby does allow for a complete reconstruction of the text. Now, while Vico's obvious aim was the conversion of Maya to Catholicism, his strategy included an affirmation of Maya religion. He not only wrote in Quichean languages in which he made his argument, assumed an intelligent Maya readership, but did so in what we call the high registered discourse of Maya ceremonial speech. Think of this as the King James Quiche. Accessing many of the same stories that a year later would appear in the Popol Vuh, Vico also appropriated names of Maya deities that he considered analogous to the biblical God, such as Tzachor Pitor, the framer and former, and Alom Kachalom, the bearer and begetter. With such names, Vico presented the Christian God according to Maya theogony as both a divine mother and father, recognizing within Maya indigenous religiosity there's a sense of gender complementarity. I kind of wish Ann Carr and Sabine McCormick could be around to know this. To this extent, he did not flatly condemn the ancient religion of his audience, but rather, in chapter 25 of volume 1, told his Maya readers to return to the religion of their forebears because, quote, Tzachor Bitol, praised by your ancestors, is the same God to whom we pray. And just to give you a slight sample set of what the text looks like, what the transcription in the colonial orthography is, and then once translated and put in sort of stanza form to recognize the poetry of the text. This is the first chapter after his introduction, his preamble. This is the first beloved concept, God, as would be said by we who are priests, the one who is the framer and former, the tzachor bitol of people, the people framer, the people former, the maker of us, the conceiver of us, the one who is the only one who made, conceived, fashioned, and formed us. We who are the fashion and formation of the benefactor and conceiver, who are perfected and conceived by God. In other words, you may be using these terms and you may think these are 4 divinities, or you may think these are 2 different gods that are composite, male, female. No. These are all names for this one true God. I'm just going to redirect your attention. Later on in chapter 3, for example, he says the third point is the telling about the distinctiveness of the being of God and from the works of God. We have just truly given you account and testified, chapters 1 and 2, about God's existence to your ears, heart, mouths, and faces, to you all who are my students, who are the works of God, the great Lord, Dios ni Mahao. Now, then, we shall state a comparison by which you may know about the existence of your mother and father, your framer and former. Actually, there was not ever God's transformation or representation. This is not a shape-shifting character like in many cases of Maya mythology. And we should never make comparisons since God's existence is distinct. It is not like the bodies of people. God's existence is not like that of people and is not like yada, yada, yada. He'll go on for a series of apophatic statements. And this will be a strategy of making cataphatic then apophatic statements, gradually leading the reader to much more of an analogous understanding. So while many of the names of these deities are much more extensive in the Maya literature, such as the Popol Vuh, we see that Vico is appropriating those that he considers most commensurate, but many of these names, according to the Maya sources, they declare as Abahuil. They are divine, divinities, for lack of a better term. an understanding that Dominicans will use to talk about divinity in general, but Franciscans will use only to refer to idolatry. Vico, though, does strategically select other names of Maya religious characters that he didn't see as theologically analogous, such as the plumed or feathered serpent, Umatz, or Quetzalcoatl, if you're familiar with the Aztec variant. And he declares that they are, in fact, suffering in the Maya otherworld, Xibalba, which he equates with the Christian notion of hell. This included the hero twins, who in the Popol Vuh are direct descendants of the divine grandmother and grandfather, and are labeled as Capawil, and finished preparing the world before the creation of the first true human beings. This is a very common motif we find in many Native American cosmogonic stories. But for Vico, they too are in Xibalba, along with various disease-ridden characters who have great names like One Death, Seven Death, Bloody Tooth, Bloody Claw, which even the Popol Vuh declares that those characters are explicitly not deities. It clarifies that those are mana kapawil. So, to shift gears for a moment, recent analysis of an earlier Dominican manuscript allows us to actually push back further in history this approach that we're noting in the Theologia Indorum. The Kislak manuscript of the U.S. Library of Congress, I think, is one of the more unique texts in any Native American language in the sense that it's less of a polished document and much more like a notebook with notes both for and from the mission field. Measuring roughly 7 by 5 inches, so think of a moleskin notebook, the document is actually a set of 15 different texts written by 9 different hands in 3 distinct Mayan languages. And while the pages are all out of order due to rebinding by someone who is unfamiliar with its contents, the core text is a set of 50 hymns in Quiché and appear to be the oldest surviving Christian songs we're aware of, composed in the Americas. A colophon appears at the provided a set of dates, and this indicates that this set of songs was completed by 1552 by an earlier group of missionaries, by the discourse presumably Dominican, who entered the region in 1544. That would be the cohort recruited by then Bishop Bartolomé de las Casas. And 2, this is not a first generation, but at least a second generation copy made in 1567. It's still early. And 3rd, references a significant event, such as a martyrdom, hence the cross, in 1555, by someone closely associated with the text. That would be the date of Domingo de Vico's death. While much of the content of these songs recount biblical stories and Christian folklore, it does so, again, in this ceremonial poetics of traditional Native Mesoamerican discourse, this King James kind of quiché, as well as throughout it uses the title of Maya gods like Tzachol Bitol, the framer and former, also found in the Popol Vuh, to refer to the Christian God alongside this Dominican neologism of Dios Nimachao, God the Great Lord. But also, as I've translated part here for you, the 12th hymn, the author specifically relegates 2 key Maya deities, the storm god, Huracan, by the way, where we get the word hurricane, and the lineage god of the Quiché regions, Tochil. He puts them both in Xibalba, and they're in league with the devil. So, for Vico and other Salmatense mendicants in Mesoamerica, the establishment of commensurability between Christianity and indigenous worldviews was predicated on analogical understandings. Paradigmatically, this is the notion and its use of analogy derived from Jewish and Islamic Aristotelianism by Aquinas to reconcile apparent inconsistencies, if not also contradictions, within Christian thought, as well as between Christianity and non-Christian thought. In this sense, as a good Thomist, Vico employed this analogical method, but toward a theological reconciliation with Highland Maya religious thought rather than medieval Judaism and Islam or ancient Greco-Roman philosophy. Though, and perhaps problematically, this was not such a stretch for Vico, since he also believed that indigenous peoples of the Americas were the direct descendants of the proverbial lost 10 tribes of Israel. So for Vico, Quiché Maya were not so much being taught an entirely new religion, but rather being reminded of their ancestors' monotheism that just now needed to be updated with Christianity. To flip the script, Vico's influence, either acceptance or rejection, among the Highland Maya can in fact be traced in their own literature. Close intertextual analysis of these native documents that I spoke about earlier show how indigenous intellectuals responded. For example, the opening lines of the Popol Vuh, written 1 year after Vico finished the first volume of his Theologia Indorum, show a near exact order of presenting their response. Specifically, where Vico begins in his introduction by declaring the value of his text, the Quiche counter with the value of their text. He says grand, they say ancient. Vico then moves to state the aim and scope of his subject matter as teaching about everything done by God, and the Quiche counter with their aim of writing down in the missionary script their cosmogonic narratives, but also as an account of everything done. Third, Vico declares that the focus of his text will facilitate a clarification and demonstration that everything is an act of God the Great Lord, and the Quiche counter that the demonstration of their text will clarify the acts of their pantheon. Fourth, Vico specifies that he will do this by talking about God like and for Christians, whereas the Quiche authors of the Popol Vuh simply acknowledge their new predicament of having to confront Vico's God talk in the presence of Christianity. And finally, whereas Vico establishes the relationship between the value of his book and the enhanced value of its Highland Maya readers, this group of his Quiche readers reply that they too have a book, but an ancient and original book they will subsequently transliterate anew. In this sense, the opening lines of the Popol Vuh, as it follows a near move-by-move reply, if not rebuttal, to Vico's preamble, and uses many of the same key terms, ukalachlobashik, clarification, ukutunishashik, demonstration, zhonochel, everything, and uchepal Dios, language of God. It highlights, no pun intended, how these Maya authors were not simply resisting settler colonial Christendom in general, but strategically using the Theologia Indorum in particular as a foil against which to represent their Maya religious worldview. Yet it only confronts Vico and his text implicitly, acknowledging enough of its impact to warrant an indirect response, but not seen as significant enough to mention by name. It's not a foregone conclusion these short, smelly, hairy, pale people are going to stick around. They're drastically outnumbered. Now, moving forward historically, other Maya documents beginning in 1554 show further influence of both the Theologia Indorum and the Popol Vuh, but by Maya authors who are more favorable to the Dominicans. For example, the first pages of the third most important Highland Maya text, the land deed of the town of Totonicapán, or title of Totonicapán, consist of a Maya redaction of key chapters directly from the Theologia Indorum, and it even lists the specific chapter numbers used, beginning with, I asked you to remember this, Vico's chapter 30, or the fourth major theme, the story of Genesis, as its opening line. And while this early Maya text accepts many of Vico's efforts to indigenize biblical stories and names of his God, its Maya authors go much further beyond the Theologia Indorum in making Christianity Maya, but on their own terms. Furthermore, by the latter pages of the Theologia Indorum, they begin to integrate myths also found in the Popol Vuh, as if they're trying to reconcile their ancient religious narratives with the biblical material presented by Vico. Now, in contrast to the resistance approach taken in the Popol Vuh, the second strategy by other Maya authors of autochthonously accommodating Christianity continues in many later Quiche documents, such as this one from 1592. However, whereas the earlier documents, like the Popol Vuh and title of Totonicapán, only implicitly refer to Vico's works, these later Maya writings explicitly mention the Theologia Indorum as their key source. And in this other one, also from 1592, they also strategically shift the origins of their devotion to the Kabawil and related effigies back further into antiquity, for them back to the time of the Hebrew enslavement by Egypt. In other words, you may be upset with us for making these offerings and devotions to these carved images, but we learned that apparently millennia ago in Egypt. You're putting your sights on the wrong people. That's not our fault. Just read Exodus. From this corpus, then, we can arrange an intertextual chronological arrangement. we could begin to construct not only a transmission history, but also a contemporaneous native reception history of their acceptance and critique of Christianity from the period of first contact into subsequent centuries. Based on archaeological evidence, there were obviously common religious narratives among the Maya and wider Mesoamericans from at least the 3rd century BCE. Franciscans and Dominicans introduced new genres from Europe, as well as the alphabet in the 1540s. Iberians, colonial officials, introduced distinct legal genres. The recent discovery of Kislak 1015 manuscript provides evidence that other Dominicans with Vico in the Maya mission field drew from local Maya worldviews and influenced the local Catholicism before Vico finished his highly impactful theology. While Vico may have written the first explicitly Christian theology in the Americas, the slightly earlier hymns, or coplas, in the Kislak manuscript seem to be the oldest original Christian pastoral texts to have survived that were composed in the Americas. By 1553, Vico's Theologia Indorum, or theological compendium, introduced a new genre that allowed him to draw together and systematize linguistic, ethnographic, and doctrinal works, as well as ancient Maya religious material. By 1554, Quiche Maya elites of the pre-Hispanic ruling class began to compile and write down their indigenous religious and social political view to become the Popol Vuh, in part as an indirect rebuttal to Vico's text. Later in 1554, Quiche, who worked with the Dominicans, wrote the title of Totonicapán as their account of the pre-Hispanic story, in which they drew from both the Theologia Indorum and their native Maya material, also found in the Popol Vuh. Their text, however, explicitly takes the genre of a land deed. Over the next decades, other Highland Maya documents also borrow from Iberian notarial genres, but primarily exclusively from Maya use. These look like they're local legal documents, like affidavits. In fact, they're never submitted to the court. They're only circulating among local Maya populations. And they continue in the vein of the title of Totonicapán, of integrating material from the Popol Vuh and the Theologia Indorum. But by the mid-1600s, with the final epidemics ravaging the area, with a loss of 90% of the Native American population throughout both continents, this indigenous paper trail thins out, with really few significant texts written by Highland Maya again into the 1970s, which then will witness a reemergence of Maya culture and religious activism that continues to this day. Mendicants, though, continue to develop pastoral texts in Mayan languages, and Maya parish scribes continue to copy by hand the Theologia Indorum, but for use by local parish priests, as well as independently by Maya elites going into the 1700s. So, as noted by Las Casas as early as the 1540s, some clergy, such as him and his Dominicans recruited from Salamanca, sought analogous terms in native languages to convey Christianity, such as Cabohuil among the Highland Maya or Teotl among the central Nahuatl-speaking population of Mexico. Just as, Las Casas also notes, some indigenous intellectuals in blue also strove to align Christianity with their native religious worldviews, with or without assistance by clergy. Tracking the semantic shifts in contentious terms like Cabohuil comparatively across the early paper trail left by mendicant and Maya authors, events varying positions and degrees of mutual appropriation, reconfiguration, and resistance of each other's theologies, including theological methods and hermeneutics. And this would remain a point of debate for most of the colonial period. For example, even centuries later, Franciscans would still equate the term Cabohuil as only referring to a carved effigy and thus idol. And Dominicans continued to argue back, as found in this piece of 18th century marginalia, that no, it meant divinity or God and God's self. By the 19th century, as a result of the historic dearth of clergy in the region, along with the rise of anti-clericalism in the Americas as well as Iberia, the mendicant paper trail even begins to thin out. But as one of the few priests who did work in the Highland Maya area, who also began to collect and recognize the value of these texts, the French priest Charles Etienne Brasseur de Bourg noted, that his Quiche parishioners, who hadn't had a priest for decades, already had a set of hymns that they were customarily singing at the end of every Mass every week and referred to God the Holy Spirit as the breath of God. However, it is not until after Vatican II that there are renewed interests in vernacular Catholicism in the region, such as the Misa Campesina or Misa Popular in Nicaragua and El Salvador. In Guatemala, with its majority indigenous population of over 65%, this included a return to Christianity in Mayan languages. As in this Trinitarian formula, in this Catholic songbook published in the 1980s by the Diocese of Quetzaltenango, these, by the way, are not the same songs that we have in the Kislak manuscript. It shows clearly the confluence over the past centuries of both the Franciscan and the Dominican discourse, enveloped with an image on the front of its colonial legacy and the enduring Maya religiosity or spirituality on the back. This colonial Dominican project, though, came to an end among Catholic clergy in Mesoamerica during the 18th century. And surprisingly, there is no direct relationship or even knowledge about Vico's Theologia Indorum with the enculturation theology movement of today among Highland Maya in Chiapas, Mexico, or even among Dominicans in Guatemala. Perhaps, ironically, if not surprisingly, among many Maya Christians, this method of striving to reconcile their indigenous worldview with a Christianity continued uninterrupted autochthonously to the present day, due more so, in part, to what the first missionaries like Vico set in motion, though perhaps unwittingly, if not also the long historical dynamics of their own Maya religiosity. Thank you.